So today's speaker is Roger Annis. He is a retired aerospace engineer as well. He was for some time a car mechanic with CN. More recently, he's been involved in a number of associations, including he is the founder of the Vancouver Ecosocialist group. He has written on climate issues since 1993, so climate or environmental issues, with first paper in '93 on the collapse of the East Coast fisheries. He's been also quite recently, lately, talking about oil train movement in North America, and has been a correspondent for the Vancouver Observer. And today he will give us a talk where he will give us some perspective on politics of oil and gas in Canada, and a lot of the examples come from papers that he has or news articles that he has published. And so please join me in welcoming Roger today for our
Hi everyone, it's very good to be with you. It's very good to be in Prince George. This city is a really important place for us to be looking at issues of climate and of resources and resource policy. You're at the confluence of so many things that are happening. The destruction of the pine forests by the beetle. You're at a crossroads of the ambitions of the oil industry. You're in a territory with very important and still unresolved issues of Aboriginal sovereignty. So it's very informative for someone like myself to come here from Vancouver and immerse myself for the 3 days in all that's happening here, read the papers, watch the newspaper. It's a very rich and challenging political environment that we face here. I come to the issue of climate politics not through a scientific or an academic background. I've been an industrial worker all my life. My last 15 years I was a technician at an aerospace manufacturer. I've lived all across Canada though, and I think that's something that gives me some important insights. I was born in Toronto. I finished high school and university in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I've lived in Montreal for 10 years. I've lived a total of almost 20 years in Vancouver. I've lived 3 years in Regina. So I've seen and learned a lot of things over time through living as well as work experience. I've worked in sawmills in British Columbia. I've worked in CN Rail. So I think I don't bring the same scientific background that some of you would have that would equip you much more to understand the issues that we're talking about today, but I think I bring a unique set of circumstances as well. And I bring a particularly strong passion for writing about ideas and crafting the ability to explain ideas to people. I like to think that I can do that in some capacities. For example, in my all the writing I've done on the oil train issue since the disaster at Lac Mégantic. So we'll see today. But what I'd like to present to you today is largely the view of how eco-socialists view the climate challenge that we have. I was part of forming the Vancouver Ecosocialist group in Vancouver last year, and I've considered myself to be an eco-socialist for a long time, even if that's a relatively new term. I've certainly been someone concerned about the environment. Part of that is my background. I lived in Nova Scotia, so I have a deep appreciation of the fishing industry there, and when the collapse of the fishery happened, the cod fishery in 1993, that was a real warning sign that something was terribly amiss in how Canada is managing its natural resources. And I'd worked the decade before that in the forestry industry here, and we only have to look at the results of decades of clear cutting that have only accentuated the pine beetle epidemic to know that something is pretty deeply flawed with how we're managing our natural resources. And now we're in the era of what I call the deepening offensive of the fossil fuel industry on the planet and on the human species. So that's what I want to share with you today. This is the website that we created last year, which we want to be a repository, especially of information in British Columbia, of what's happening in all of the climate-related issues in the province. We're not trying to reproduce the important work that eco-socialists are doing in other parts of North America. with websites, for example, that are much more focused on issues of political theory and strategy. But we do want to be a good source of information for what's happening in this region of the Earth, and also to provide news and information from those in the region here of what's happening elsewhere in the world. So we're trying to perfect that as best we can. And we came together as a group because we all share three things, two of which we share with anyone concerned about the planet. We're concerned about what science is telling us of where this planet is headed in conditions of rising greenhouse gas emissions and therefore rising average global temperatures. We're concerned about a runaway society in which there's no limit to growth, to production, to extraction, to burning. And as eco-socialists, we bring a particular perspective to that. We think that there's something endemic to the capitalist system that's causing this, and that can't be solved within the framework of capitalism. And by capitalism, I mean an economic system that's founded on private ownership of the means of production, on the generalization of production not for use, not for common and socially useful purpose, but rather for the sale of goods and the reaping of profit. And finally, by capitalism, I mean a system that has no mechanism of self-control. It's all about expansion. Capitalism that doesn't expand collapses and asphyxiates itself. And so that's a bit of the unique perspective that we bring to the issue. We share the views of the increasing consensus among scientists in the world today that we have a very serious and alarming issue of global warming in front of us, causing significant changes in all the weather patterns in the Earth. And I won't spend any time convincing you of that. You're either convinced of that by now, or your concerns are already well founded. And there's not too much I can add to what the likes of the IPCC has said in its recent and previous reports. This was an important report by the International Energy Agency that looked at how the world is producing and consuming energy and whether or not that's sustainable, which it isn't. And this was a particularly alarming news report that came out towards the end of last year about new research into what the science of cloud formation tells us about how this is going to affect temperatures going ahead. And so, unfortunately, we've learned through this most recent research that we're looking at the worst end of the scale of possibilities that scientists have been telling us as to what kind of increases in global temperatures that we can expect, even if we succeed, which is at this point not clear, even if we succeed in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now we're looking at the higher end of the range of possible rises, which is not the kind of news that we wanted to hear at the end of last year, but should give further impetus to us to understand better the issue and try to do something about it. I'm sure you're all familiar with the figures. We're seeing just increases in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere that are right off the scale. Patterns, for several 100,000 years that we're just blowing right through in the matter of a couple of decades. These are, it's a chart of average CO2 emissions and temperatures going back 400,000 years. This was published in the Washington Post at the end of last year. And then this is the CO2 emissions as recorded at Mauna Loa, if I have the pronunciation correct, in Hawaii, which last year reached 400 parts per million of CO2 for the first time in, a very, very long time. So again, just in a matter of decades, alarming increases in CO2 emissions with no limit yet. We keep blowing through the records. I'm sorry, this was the figures from 1958 onward. Just so there you are, what's that? 50 years. A huge jump again. So all reason to be profoundly concerned about how we can curb this, begin to slow it down, and eventually bring down these emissions. Why are our political and industrial leaders seemingly incapable of doing anything about this. They're taking us into worse territory than before. It's really a puzzle to, normal thinking people why we would keep going further along the road of fossil fuel extraction and burning in particular, although there's other major contributing factors to global warming as well. It would seem a puzzle because it doesn't make sense from a rational or human point of view, and that's where I think where we need to study more deeply the economic system that we're dealing with and the driving imperatives of that economic system that seem to overwhelm rational human thought, that seem to make our political leaders incapable of stepping back, pausing, looking at things, and seeing if there isn't a different course. We're not only sort of correcting the course here or even beginning the discussion. It's going deeper and deeper and deeper. Natural gas, coal, tar sands, it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And either something is totally crazy in the psyche of those that presently run the economy and the government, or there's some economic driving forces here at work that we need to understand in order to begin to try and push this back. I want to look firstly at the scale of what's happening with fossil fuels, and I apologize if this will be familiar material to you, but it may hopefully not. May not be for some, and so it's a good review. We're seeing an expansion of coal production and export, even though we know that coal is probably the worst of the fossil fuels that we could be digging up and burning. And even still to this day in Canada, we burn a substantial amount of coal for our electricity. Alberta gets more than half of its electricity from burning coal. Saskatchewan, almost half. A big chunk in Ontario. Again, in Nova Scotia, more than half. This is a decades-old problem, and the awareness is decades old, and yet why are we still burning coal? And perhaps even more importantly, why do our consumption patterns of energy continue to rise with no seeming capacity to bring it into line and reduce it? And of course, it's even worse in the United States, where still about 40% of electrical production comes from coal. And again, no really sharp plan to bring that down. Decades-old problem, unchanged, unmoved. We're not the biggest coal producer compared to the United States. We produce about half the oil the U.S. does, and less than 10% of the coal, but it's still a pretty substantial amount. And what's interesting that's changed in the United States is the figure in the middle there for coal produced in the western United States. Well, that's the big increase that's gone on in past decades, and that's the coal that rumbles by here in the trains on its way to Prince Rupert, among other destinations. But Prince Rupert is a favored location for coal export because people on the west coast of the United States are growing more aware that they have societal responsibilities with respect to coal, and there are communities that simply won't allow coal export terminals to be built. Last year alone, there were 3 proposed coal export terminals that were refused permission. And there's 3 that are the industry wants to have. One of them is just outside of Bellingham, just south of us in Vancouver. And there's a terrific community movement in Bellingham and Whatcom County to stop that coal train terminal from being built. If that one is built, it's called Gateway Pacific. It will be the largest coal export terminal in North America. But as things stand now, Vancouver is the largest coal export terminal in North America, and Prince Rupert will soon be 3rd if the expansion plans at Ridley go ahead as planned. So we're right up there. The 2 ports in this province are up there in the top 5 of coal exporting ports. And so somewhere in there we have a responsibility to this planet, to the human race, to say something and do something about that, because it's all very well to just sell the stuff abroad and say, well, it's not our problem anymore, but it is our problem, because everything that gets burned, it doesn't matter where it gets burned in the world, it comes back here in one form or another. These are all of the oil and gas that's available in shale throughout the continent. Of course, we're aware of what's up in the northeast of BC, a lot of those colored figures there. It's a very big area of natural gas that the industry is very anxious to rapidly increase production and sell abroad in the form of LNG. The big Bakken circle you see in the middle of the continent there, North Dakota, Saskatchewan, Alberta, that's where a lot of the oil has been coming from in these recent train explosions. And that's an oil field that's completely transformed the landscape of North Dakota and increasingly of Saskatchewan, from being a farm province, a prairie province. Those landscapes have been torn up by the oil industry, and it's you may have seen the photo from space of North Dakota. The flaring of the gas is coming either from oil or gas as it's drawn up, and the pollutants are filtered out, as can be seen from space. The lights of North Dakota, of the flaring of the gas, are kind of rival the lights coming from Minneapolis, St. Paul, a major metropolitan center about 6 hours east of the field. So, but that's just one of many of these. Still, despite all the decades of extraction and burning of fossil fuels, there's still lots more there underground if we are foolish enough to continue digging it up and burning it. That's the network of oil pipelines as it exists now, of companies operating in Canada and where it transits south of the border. So these are U.S. or Canadian companies, all focused on Alberta, as you can see. And so far, no line there going out to the area of Prince Rupert, but that's where Northern Gateway wants to go. And also, there's no line yet in Northern Ontario, but again, there's proposals to change this map very substantially in the years ahead. I don't need to tell you anything about Trans Mountain or Northern Gateway. You may be a little less familiar with Trans Mountain because it doesn't come through here, but that's the red line is the proposal to roughly triple the amount of oil. In this case, it'll be tar sands bitumen coming from Alberta into the port of Vancouver, and then the other line you're familiar with, it's not on this map, goes directly west, Northern Gateway. This is a new pipeline proposal for Ontario and Quebec. The red line at the bottom running through southern Ontario is an existing oil pipeline, and for some decades it's been used to bring foreign oil in by ship as far as Montreal and then on to Sarnia and a couple of other refineries along the way. Well, now Enbridge wants to reverse the flow of that line, so this would now begin to take bitumen or conventional oil to the refineries in Montreal and also quite possibly or potentially, shall we say, 2 points east. The other line on the top there is the existing gas pipeline that comes from Western Canada to Ontario and Quebec. But this Line 9, it's called, the oil pipeline in the south there, has just been through its round of public hearings in southern Ontario and Quebec before the National Energy Board. And so as with Northern Gateway, the NEB will make a recommendation to the federal government. And it's highly contested. It goes through very heavily populated areas, including right through the city of Toronto. If you know Toronto, the line as it exists, it runs in between Finch Avenue and Steeles Avenue and crosses the whole route that you see across southern Ontario. It just crosses untold numbers of streams, rivers, First Nations territories, towns, cities. It's a bit of a madcap proposal, including the fact that it's a very old pipeline, and so not built to whatever standards they might build something today. And of course, Enbridge, you might recall, is the company that had the spill in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So that one is up for debate and proposal. And this is the real biggie. This is the Energy East pipeline that TransCanada would like to build using the existing gas route, much of the existing gas route to get there. And this would be for the first time to carry conventional or bitumen from Alberta to markets in Ontario and Quebec, but also quite possibly abroad, including you see the two variants, one of the variants with a dotted line there, which would take that pipeline on to St. John, New Brunswick. And there's another variant running south of Montreal to Portland, Maine, where there is already an existing pipeline, but a variant of this proposal would be to pipe a part of that oil for export at Portland, Maine. So this is very much an international issue. contention over this pipeline. And then the two very large ones right now that are going through their application process and very hotly contested, number one on the top, which is Northern Gateway, and then the red one, number two, which is Keystone XL. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs was in Washington, D.C. yesterday to make yet again a very strong pitch. Even the photos of him speaking, he's got his hand clenched like that, telling the American government, you must let us proceed with this, stop delaying, stop dilly-dallying. And this is the network of gas pipelines in Canada or that extend into the U.S. If you looked at a map of the U.S. of its gas pipelines, it looks like a very, very intricate spider web. So these are just the main lines in Canada, and you see the one through Northern Ontario that exists, and also the relatively new gas pipeline from Nova Scotia that goes through New Brunswick and into Maine. And then there's two of the dotted lines up in the northwest here. Well, there's actually, I count four on this map, but the dotted lines are the proposed pipelines that would feed LNG. One of them would come all the way down from the Beaufort Sea, down the Mackenzie Valley pipeline. And then the ones you're more familiar with that would come approximately past here and on to Kitimat and Prince Rupert and so on. So that's a little bit of an overview of the scale of the whole thing. This is the Mackenzie Valley one that I mentioned. The red part of this, by the way, has received approval from the National Energy Board, but the blue is still what's up for grabs with LNG. And then all of a sudden we've had thrown into the mix oil by train, and this is something I've spent quite a bit of time writing about because I've been to Lac Mégantic. I actually rode that rail line when I was a teenager. The rail line connecting Montreal to St. John, New Brunswick used to be a CP rail passenger line. So like everyone, I was pretty shocked by what happened. And then also I had a feeling that there was more to the story than just a train going awry in a small town. And sure enough, we're learning more each month, which I want to share with you a little bit here today as to what happened in Lac Mégantic and why. But this oil by train phenomena has just exploded in past 3 years from fairly low levels. Not as low, by the way, as the media is saying. They're talking about like 500 carloads of movement of oil in 2009. They were much more substantial than that compared to Statistics Canada, but nonetheless a very substantial jump in oil traffic being moved by train beginning in the year 2010. So I've been writing a lot about this, but I wrote a very substantive article just recently that Philippe mentioned in the introduction. It was published in Truth Out last week. I invite you to read it. Vancouver Observer also published it. But it's a pretty substantive look back at the past 6 months and what we've learned by all of the studies and inquiries by journalists or by railway safety authorities. I think we can explain why oil by train is happening for three reasons. World oil prices are making North American oil competitive, at least on the same terrain as oil from from foreign sources. As we know, the oil in Alberta and the tar sands in Alberta are landlocked, so there's no easy way out. They require pipelines to move substantial amounts, and we know there's a considerable environmental opposition to those pipelines. And then the third reason is that it's a lot easier to move oil by rail. You don't need anybody's permission. The railways in this country are more powerful than the federal government, so they do what they do unless enough citizen awareness and opposition can be created to put curbs on it. So, all three of these things explain why we've seen this massive expansion of oil by rail take place. One of the things about Lac Mégantic that's so remarkable is it only took a little more than a year for this to happen. This was oil contracted by Irving Oil to get to its refinery in St. John. That movement only began in the spring of 2012. They had been doing getting some of it to their refinery by using a barge operation out of Albany, New York, that would take barges down the Albany Hudson River and load it onto ships in New York. And there were also a few sort of dilapidated railway lines in New England that were moving small amounts of oil. But the Lac Mégantic route only began in 2012, so about a year before it all literally blew apart, with very tragic consequences for the people living in this town. The X that's on the map here is approximately where Lac Mégantic is. So if you just draw a line running east from Montreal there to St. John, that's approximately the historic CP rail line that was built in the 1880s and 90s. And it had passenger service on it until the late 1980s. I remember taking it once. But CP Rail wanted to get rid of that line beginning in the 1980s, and it took some time to get regulatory approval. But by the middle 1990s, they had hived it off, sold it off to, and there's been 3 companies that have owned it since, and the most recent owner was the one that was carrying the oil that exploded. The Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway, as it's called, which I'm sure you became familiar with through all the news coverage of Lac Mégantic. So MM&A took the oil from just a little bit east of Montreal to St. John. They were part of the contracting operation to get the oil to St. John on a very dilapidated line. This was a company that really had no time or money or much interest in maintaining the rail line and rail bed itself, so it was a disaster waiting to happen. What's remarkable is that it could even have such an operation, such an oil by train operation, could have been allowed to proceed with all of the terrible consequences that we saw that day on July 6th. 47 people died. And also less covered in the news perhaps is the spilling of spilling of millions of liters of oil into the waters here. This is Lac Mégantic on your right, and then that's the beginning of the river that eventually ends up in the St. Lawrence River, and so just several millions of liters of fuel from the trains ended up in the lake and in the river. So huge cleanup, and of course you never fully clean these things up, so a river polluted for some time to come. But lo and behold, that wasn't the first of it. This is October in Gainford, Alberta, west of Edmonton. I'm sorry, I forget my numbers. I think it's 11 cars that exploded in flame when a CN rail on the CN main line, the best rail line that money can buy in Canada today, on its way presumably to Prince Rupert. So that was in October. That's a close-up of the Gainford crash. There was, not long after Gainford was another crash of North Dakota Oil in Alabama. And then we had the big one in visual terms. Thankfully, no one was injured in this one. As also with Gainford, no one was injured. This is in Castleton, North Dakota. And then just last week, January 7th, was the crash in New Brunswick. Again, on a CN main line. The best line that CN can buy and maintain. And then 2 that weren't that well reported happened right in the very center of Calgary. This is the Bonnybook Bridge that crosses the Bull River that you see underneath there. And so in June, not long after the record flooding that hit the city, the old bridge, just buckled under the weight of an oil train that was going over. And I think it was 6 cars that were disabled and had to be sort of rescued from, thankfully nothing leaked into the river. And then in August, in the Calgary neighborhood of Inglewood, you can see the houses there, there was a train moving at low speed, but somehow, I think it was again 6 cars of that train went off. Again, no puncture of the railway car vessels, but a pretty shocking event for both of these for the citizens of Calgary, because one thing that Calgarians found out, as all of these other towns that have been hit by this have been found out, is nobody knows what's going on with this stuff. How many of these trains are going by? When? What are they carrying exactly? What do we do if there's an accident? And you get these enormous, potentially, either enormous or potentially enormous rail accidents, and it's up to a local fire department to look after it. In Plaster Rock, New Brunswick, is the volunteer fire department. Well, obviously they're not equipped to deal with catastrophes of that scale, but that's where we stand today with railway regulation. We don't know what's going on. The thing doesn't appear to be safe, and local authorities aren't equipped to deal with it when the disasters happen. And maybe the craziest oil by rail scheme of all is this one that would take oil up to Churchill. for export across an increasingly melting permafrost underground here in northern Manitoba. This line in red used to be a CN rail line, but it was bought by an American company called Omnitrax, I think about 20 years ago, if I have my date right. Still has a passenger service on it to Churchill. But they want to begin an oil by rail operation, again, from this dangerous oil from North Dakota up to the port of Churchill. What's really not come out yet, unless you read the coverage of what happened at Lac Mégantic, is just how wildly things were out of control with that oil by rail operation. This was run along a rail line which, if you saw the subsequent news coverage, was clearly not in any condition whatever to carry the kind of heavy trains that oil signifies. That was a 73-car train. These cars are very heavy. They don't weigh. They're not grain cars or the kind of railway cars carrying lumber or materials like this. These are very heavy, heavy vehicles running along old rail lines that haven't been maintained well. There's some incredible photos of that rail line that appeared in the Globe and Mail, including of a couple of the overpasses over rivers that were just bridges just waiting to collapse. And then we found out a lot of this was through the persistence of the reporting team at the Globe and Mail that the oil in North Dakota that's brought out of the Bakken field is exceptionally volatile. It's full of gases that cause it to be not. It's a chemical constituency that's not much different than gasoline. And so, lo and behold, it turns out that the company's drawing out this oil, loading it into rail cars, and then the companies that were contracting to bring it knew all of this. They talked about it and speculated about. They also, in some cases, falsified the documentation, indicating exactly what the volatility, the danger of the product is. So all of this has come out, and you may have heard in just prior to Christmas, the Transportation Safety Board raided the office of Irving Oil in St. John to get more information of exactly what it is Irving Oil, as well as its railway partners, and the companies loading the oil in North Dakota. Exactly what did they know about what they were doing? Clearly, in any reasonable justice system, there are criminal liability is called for here. And of course, it's standard fare in the railway industry that the communities that were being unwittingly subjected to this danger knew nothing, were told nothing. Of course, they saw the rail cars going by, but who's going to answer their question of what's going on? And then in the specific case of the NMNA, it was one of two small railways in Canada for which Transport Canada gave specific approval to operate with one operator only. And so on that fateful night in question, a train operator who'd done his work shift, parked his train on an incline, now had to follow through the procedure of locking down manually after a full day of work. And if you ever seen a rail car and the force involved to lock it down manually, whatever the regulations told him, I think every fifth car, every eighth car, something didn't happen right there, and perhaps the investigation will ultimately tell us, but clearly an untenable situation from the point of view of public safety to have a town sitting above the hill where this train was subject to such a danger. Not long after the accident itself, this is the middle of the month of August, Prime Minister Harper was in St. John along with to promote the Energy East pipeline that I spoke to you about earlier, that Irving was running. And by the way, a backdrop to the story of the recent train derailment in Plaster Rock, New Brunswick, is that the train that derailed there was one of those that was, when the accident in Lac Mégantic happened, they just switched over the movement of the oil to the main CN line that connects Montreal to Halifax, going through Quebec and northern New Brunswick. So there's just a very smooth switchover of that operation. So all of a sudden the people on that CN main line, including on Plaster Rock, were getting the same train as Lac Mégantic got, although thankfully on a better maintained rail line, that is the main CN rail line between Montreal and Halifax. But nonetheless, I was quite struck in following the news, including reading Quebec newspapers, because I'm bilingual. I read French, that there was almost no reporting of this, no public discussion. Should we be concerned that we're going to be getting the same trains through our communities now that Lac Mégantic? I was quite surprised, and I can't really explain that. Maybe it's just we're so used to the power and the authorities of railways in this country that we just don't question it, or we assume that they know what they're doing and they're going to do things safely. But I think these oil trains that are now running through New Brunswick to replace what was going through Lac Mégantic, I think are no safer today than they were a year ago. And by the way, one of the business partners in the Irving Oil arrangement at Lac Mégantic was Canadian Pacific. It brought the oil from North Dakota to Montreal, or Farnham, just south of Montreal. And CP Rail is resisting providing compensation to the Quebec government for the cost of cleanup, and also the lawsuit by the victims who are suing those that constructed this economic enterprise to bring those trains through Lac Mégantic. CP Rail is a major mover of oil by rail, has been so for several years now, and CN is rushing to catch up. So, why all of this? It flies in the face of science, of reason, of safety. Oil by rail is, the most egregious example of it all, but you live in the natural gas regions of northeast British Columbia and worry about hydrogen sulfide and other contaminants in the air, the spills of tar sands pipelines. Why are we doing this? We have the science that can give us alternatives. We don't need to be burning fossil fuels. And in our view, we can only explain this by looking at the mechanisms and the dynamics that operate our economic system. It only knows growth. And those companies, those enterprises, those industries that don't strive for growth will die. Because if they don't do it, then the competitor is going to do it. And yes, there can be islands of reason and of rational economic decisions and planning, but they're only islands. They're still surrounded by the sea of greed, of the drive for profit, of this built-in drive in the capitalist system for expansion. And that's what we have to bring under control. What people do in their particular parts of the world to try and stop the worst excesses of the fossil fuel industry are very important. These are the citizens of Calgary who they went out in protest after the derailment in August that I showed you, because they want those oil trains away from their neighborhood in the center of Calgary, and they're completely right to do that. These are the people in southern New Brunswick who fought against fracking last year. You saw the news, and they scored some victories in forcing a moratorium on the gas fracking, which Irving Oil had contracted with a company from Texas. And they stood up against considerable odds. They faced court injunctions and some quite violent behavior for a couple of days by the RCMP, but they stood their ground and won some progress. We in Vancouver are fighting against the building of a third coal export terminal on the Fraser River called Fraser River Docks. And this is a rally that we had late last year, and one of my favorite placards ever at a protest that I've been at. I love that sentiment. Coltrane good. Yeah, I agree. I've always been a fan of John Coltrane. Coltrane bad. So we're fighting that coal terminal on the Fraser River. And of course, this was the healing walk that happened last year in Vancouver. Everything I'm talking about with fossil fuel is addressing fundamental issues of Aboriginal sovereignty, because all of these fossil fuel projects inevitably involve violations of sovereignty, whether it's because they're going to be going across unceded territory, or in the case of the Northeast here with natural gas, they're going to be putting out pollutants to the air and water that are a violation of the rights of the people who live in that region. So this is always a very important aspect of what we talk about with the fossil fuel industry. And we were very happy to see James Anaya come to Canada. I attended the one-day session that he had in Vancouver, and it was quite moving because First Nations from all across the province came to the Musqueam territory and gave presentations of the different issues that they're facing. Some of them had to do with Northern Gateway, but lots of them had to do with mining, a couple with the big ski hill projects and so on. And of course, one of our most recent heroes really is Neil Young. He doesn't have to be doing this. He's a wealthy man. He has a very creative and fulfilling life, I'm sure, and we salute him for the stand that he's taken, and we hope that more people like him will do this because they speak with authority and credibility. I think his last concert is, I think it still hasn't happened yet. He's placed Calgary as the last of his 4 concerts. I want to close with a couple of the books that we have been reading and studying and recommending particularly. I think most will be familiar with this book by James Hansen, who's the former scientist at the Goddard Institute at NASA, who's left his job at NASA in order to campaign for the planet, for the saving of the human race. These are 4 articles that pertain in particular to our ideas of ecosocialism and these reckless economic dynamics that are driving the capitalist system. We recommend each of these writers highly as producing very informed articles on what we face. And one of our objectives in Vancouver in the coming year is to bring some of these writers, especially the last 3 who are very specifically focused on issues of science and social science, to come on speaking tours and inform us better of all that's happening. These 2 authors, these 2 books by these 2 authors, we think are particularly important contributions to understanding the economic changes that we need to make if we're to create an economy that's sustainable. As eco-socialists, we share the views of those who believe that we need a rapid and massive degrowth of our economy, of our society. The levels of consumption that we get convinced to sustain they're unsustainable environmentally, and they're also they're not desirable socially either. So we share that view that we need. We're not talking about putting an end to the increases in CO2 emissions and the other pollutants or trying to reach a level law point. No, we need a massive reduction, and we need it the sooner the better. And that's the kind of economic order we need too. We don't need any economic order that's based on endless growth and expansion and endless consumption is doomed. And we want to get off that train wreck before it happens. So we share that view of the massive reduction that's involved. But where we would disagree with many is we don't think that this economic order as it's presently constituted can somehow be won to a different course. We believe there are vested interests far too powerful to agree to that. They must be displaced politically. They have to be pushed to the side. They will resist that with their money, with their power, with their influence. They will make it illegal to have electric cars. They will shut down transit systems as they did after World War II. There is no end to what they will do to try and prevent this. So, but we can counter that effectively if we're aware and if we're mobilized. And it's the fight of our lives. The last book I'll mention is this one also by John Bellamy Foster, which really gives a very deep appreciation of how much the philosophical thinking of the 19th century was rooted in an appreciation of the very close relationship of humans to nature. The moment that we start to divorce ourselves from nature, that is, the moment we start to shirk our responsibilities towards protecting and improving nature, we're headed down the wrong path. And much to our appreciation with his writing and research, we find that Marx and Engels in their time were just among the philosophers of the age who shared that view. It was nothing particularly unique to them, but they embraced that view that the scientists of the day. And to the extent that Marxism in the 20th century has become associated with the trashing of the environment that went on in the countries that tried to make that transition away from capitalism, in the Soviet Union, in China, elsewhere, we don't think that has much to do with Marxism, really. In doing that, they were repudiating what they could have learned had they gone back to study Marx and Engels closely. So that's another book that we recommend. I'll leave it there because it's not much time, but I'm really keen to know what your own thoughts and experiences on this. And so I'll leave you with a couple of suggested websites. Thank you for your attention and concern, and I look forward to, albeit brief, good exchange with you here. Thanks.
got almost 15 minutes of questions, and I'll just come to whoever with the mics or online people. Yep.
There's one from
Yeah.
online right away.
Sure, you can do one.
This question is from Paul Sanborn. He says that some on the left, so the political left, dismiss concerns about population growth as a multiplier for the human ecological footprint. And he would like to know, what is your view on that?
There's been several good books published on this, including one by a colleague in Ottawa named Ian Angus. A future rational society will discuss an ideal population policy, but we don't think that the excesses of this capitalist society and the trashing of the environment and the stresses on the environment are due to population per se. We've made great advances in food production in past decades that have, set aside those that claimed even just some decades ago that we'd be facing mass starvation in the world by today with the population that we have. So we're not convinced that the road to go in resolving the beginning to address the climate crisis is to the road of population reduction, forced or otherwise, because we think that's a distraction from what the real problem is, which is that we have an economic system which, however blindly, benefits and is propelled by this endless goal of expansion. So, and I'll try and recall the name of the book by Ian Angus while we go through the discussion period. But it was published last year by Monthly Review Press and is a very effective, I think, answer to the arguments that population growth is a major part of why we're facing climate degradation.
Not directly related to petroleum. You mentioned early in the talk that you saw that the clear cutting was aggravating the mountain pine beetle problem. I would like to know why. Both my parents came from Germany. They saw how the forests of Schwabia, the Black Forest, are managed very meticulously. You have foresters, you have selected logging. And coming to British Columbia, they saw clear cutting, and to them this was an affront. And I am just very curious as to how it ties into mountain pine beetle, just for my own personal knowledge.
Sure. Very quickly, the beetle has existed in time immemorial. It's only in, the last decade now that we're facing record levels of epidemic. And so it's a combination of how winter temperatures aren't getting cold enough to kill the larvae during the winter, but also our forests have been transformed over the past 100 to really only about 100 years in British Columbia. Clear cutting, followed by planting largely of uniform species. So we don't get the tree mix anymore in the forests that were there originally. So yeah, the pine beetle can take out the pine trees, but we've still got hemlock and fir, and we've got deciduous trees. Now we have these massive, very uniform plantations of trees. I'm actually very keen to know what kind of research into this is going on, because I don't claim to be an expert here. I know what I see. When I see a clear cut and I see what grows up, I know there's something deeply at fault. The cutting practice itself is at fault, and the replanting is not being done such that we arrive back at a mixed forest as would be originally there. But that's what I mean. I think it's it's that taking out of these massive blocks by clear cutting and then having a very poor secondary forest come in its place that just opens it up to the beetle like never before.
Thank you very much.
Andrew Nikiforov's book, The Empire of the Beetle, is a fantastic book, and hopefully there'll be more like it because it's such a big story that's largely unknown outside of this part of the world.
One of the things that struck me with the examples that you showed of moving the oil by rail is it simply a matter that the cars are much bigger and much heavier for just transport of that one commodity than compared to other things like coal and things like this? You don't hear reports of coal derailments to the same extent that you're hearing with the oil derailments. And is it simply a matter that there is an actual difference between the transport of these different goods, or is it just because if a coal car spills, it doesn't create as massive a catastrophe, and so it's not reported as much? Is there actual differences between these?
I think it's both. The oil cars are definitely heavier, although that's a good point, and I'll go and do my research and compare the weight of an oil car to a coal car. They're definitely heavier. This stretch in Gainford, for example, was known to be a bog, and the local residents talked about that afterwards, that even though it was a modern CN line, the best that money can buy, nonetheless is going over a bog. So now you've got large numbers of oil trains beginning to roll over that, yeah. And I think also, though, that the the old phrase, if a tree falls in the night, does anyone notice? Well, if a derailment happens. When I did my reporting, I almost said research. It wasn't research. The researchers did this, and I reported that we have a large number of train derailments that aren't reported in Canada. If they're deemed to be small and minor, that is, there's no loss of life, there's no huge property damage, there's no big explosion of fire, it just doesn't. It stays on the company record, and you and I never know about it. So I'm sure it's the combination of both. That these are much heavier and more frequently operated, and when they happen, they get headlines, whereas a grain car, even a coal car, although I must say the coal train derailment in Vancouver has certainly got a lot of eyes opened, and rightly so, because that same line is taking oil cars to the, sorry, it's not the same line, but very close by is the CP rail line that's taking oil cars to the Chevron refinery. So all of a sudden people are going in Vancouver going, what? Nobody give me a choice on whether I have an oil train running through my neighborhood. So that one happened to grab headlines, but yeah, unless it spills into a river, who knows, yeah.
All right. So I have two questions from online. One is rather inflammatory and one is rather long. So I'll just give them both to you so you can have a go at them. The first one is, do you have any thoughts on the quote-unquote accidents while there is a push for pipeline approvals? So I'm assuming that person is asking if they are intentional or not. And another commentator is thanking you for your comments on the fallacy of sustainable growth. And he's wondering if you have any advice on transitioning the public into a new model of prosperity, changing those ideals from what we know to what could be.
Quickly, yes, there's a lot of theories out there, because I like to follow the comments on newspaper articles, because you often find people that are in the area say things you wouldn't see in the newspaper report. They have an insight. Oh, I used to work in the railway, here's what happened. So yeah, you see a lot of people wondering, are these accidents actually happenings that help to promote the pipelines? I don't think so. I think the rail companies and the oil companies are pretty nefarious, but not quite that nefarious yet, and I think they have confidence that they, after all, they more or less run the government, so eventually they'll get their way. That's my thought on that. But yeah, sustainability, I'm glad this was brought up, because one of the things that we've been doing, and we've only just begun this, is we want to take a discussion into the trade unions and also into their political party, the NDP, of why we need to make a transition to a non-fossil fuel economy and to a planned socialist economy. And a very important part of that proposal is we have to address what happens to the people that are working now in the resource industries that are not sustainable or that are destructive. And we have to have policies that provide for a transition of people from whatever walk of life they may have, where they can transition to a different walk of life. It's going to be a different life because our fossil fuel consumption has to, first of all, our fossil fuel consumption has to end, basically, as soon as we can. But even our energy consumption, we're not talking about a new society where we just replace the same degree of energy consumption, most of it wasteful, 85% of it wasteful, with something new called green energy. No, even the so-called green energies cannot be sustained at the level that this capitalist society is trying to sustain. And so many people we're all going to change our lives through the course of this, so we have to make a convincing argument politically and socially that it's a desirable way to go. We have to provide for people who will be the most immediately affected by it. They're going to, they have to change their job, maybe where they live is sustainable. I don't know, but it's a very wrenching turn in society, and we have to approach this through common approaches where we're not dictating to people what they must do, but rather we have to come to a consensus to make this necessary change. That's going to be very difficult to do. We've never done anything like this in human history. But on the other hand, we've never been more equipped to understand the challenge and the need to do it. So we remain hopeful despite the big odds that we're up against.
So generally speaking, everyone in here has pretty similar politics and sort of an understanding of the right thing to do. But given that obtaining political offices and getting into those positions of power is traditionally understood in our society, it's incredibly difficult, it takes a long time to do. I'm curious how we can bring the other side into the debate and make them allies rather than adversaries.
I agree. I'm all for that. I mean, anyone who's respectful of the natural environment we live in is automatically has to be inclined to be thinking of getting off of this freight train out of control. So yeah. On the other hand, something is preventing that and that percentage of the population that seems to be holding on to the old ways from doing so, which, by the way, are exaggerated. If you crunch the numbers on how adults vote in this country, the Conservative Party in Ottawa only gets 22% of the adult population voting it. So it's not the 50% that that doesn't vote. It's the 20%, and then but also I don't assume that people that are supporting the Liberal Party have come over to an environmental view. So yeah, we have still a very, very large part of the population has to be won to the idea that we have to get off this course that we're on. So for sure, utmost respect and debate and dialogue with those who are not yet convinced, but we also have to challenge them, because there's no reason not to be convinced. You're defying logic and science by refusing what's staring us in the face.
Regarding the issues around the Enbridge pipeline, I know a lot of people are opposing it and framing it in the concept of protecting our environment, protecting our planet from this, protecting ourselves from the spilling. I feel that this argument against it, which I firmly support, would get farther if people could frame it along the lines of jobs. How is this going to affect jobs in the province? What jobs will it put at risk simply by being in fisheries, in forestry, in tourism? Do you have any suggestions on how to do that?
I think we have to perfect our arguments. It's true that every dollar spent on a tar sands pipeline will produce 10 more jobs doing socially useful things. These fossil fuel projects are capital intensive. They don't produce that many jobs. They have all the risks that we know about, but mostly they prevent us from getting to the real social investments that we need to be making. We should be investing in alternative technologies, alternative energy sources. We've got a lot of things that we've lost in our social safety net through all the years of cuts and so on. I mean, the list is endless. But also, I mean, it's going to take a lot of effort and energies. I don't mean energy, I mean efforts, human efforts, to figure out how we're going to de-consumerize this society. That's going to be a very difficult thing to do. So there's no end of need for resources to devote ourselves to all the fossil fuel expenses, just like all those billions that we're spending on highways in the Vancouver region, billions on bridges and highways. If you're starved up here for transit and roads, it's because they're spending billions in Vancouver, so that port can be bringing goods in and out to make the money for all those that do. The train service that we lost here, I came up here 10 years ago on the train. What a shame I couldn't do that again. So we have tremendous investments that we have to make for the social good, and that all the stuff with fossil fuel is just, it's not only, ecologically harmful, but it's delaying us from getting to the really urgent tasks that we have.
So what I hear you saying is because so much money is being put into the fossil fuel industries in this country, it's diverting funds away from other necessary areas, such as infrastructure for the north.
Yes, it is. But also I think those that are promoting fossil fuels also promote austerity. They like fossil fuels, they don't like public education. They like fossil fuels, they don't like effective health care. Not just having good hospitals, but having health care in the community, and the list is long. So the two, the pro-fossil fuel and the anti-social agenda, I think are, they're not coincidental. They come from a similar set of, a similar ideology, and also I think a similar set of economic interests. There's a question back here. Yeah.
One more question.
So one thing that has been talked about in British Columbia, in Alberta, in Ottawa, it's jobs. It's jobs, it's the economy, and in my opinion, it shouldn't be the economy, it should be our economy. Whenever we refer to the economy, it's something that's separate from us. It is our economy. We run it, we own it. It's always talked about in terms of the economy, running and jobs and prosperity. We really need to look at long-term vision of what it means for our economy and our prosperity. And that's where I think we're getting hammered. I think that's the issue, is that it's a divide in the ground that says anybody that's not with these projects is against jobs, is against the economy, is against prosperity, where we have to change that narrative and say long-term prosperity is in these other industries, and talk about jobs. We have to speak the language of how these other people talk. The other thing that was going to come up about how do we make our economy or how do we make our economy less, or how do we become happier with what we have? You know, what makes us happy? What makes us happy is making things, discovering things, and giving things. And those things are all very much low consumerist activities. We don't need to be buying a lot to be happy. And so when we can shift the narrative away from financial gain to what about these other parts of our economy, such as the happiness economy or how our societies function, then we can move forward in a direction that people can say, let's take a break, let's take a look and say that Canada is actually doing fairly well right now. The added pipelines are not going to bring in a new era of financial wealth to everyone in this country. So let's look at the relative frame of how important these projects are to us. So it's just more of a comment, but yeah, it's these jobs. That's what I always see. Money and jobs. It's just that's what they're promoting.
I agree, and I think it's a shame that the pro-fossil fuel argument has that monopoly over the claim to jobs, and that's a function of the weakness of our political opposition. I think our NDP and our unions they're not forceful. They're almost, it seems, unwilling and afraid to talk about the alternative agenda, because then we're talking about a fundamental challenge to the status quo. But we need that. I mean, to see the federal government threaten to close door-to-door mail delivery and refuse to increase Canada Pension Plan when everybody in the country wants it, it seems, at them, these cuts to unemployment insurance that they've carried out over the years, to see all that happen with relatively little opposition and protest, it's astounding. That has to change. We need a union movement, and we need community organizations that start getting mobilized and active in politics. And then we can begin to occupy the stage of the discussion over jobs. Because, yeah, we have a way better plan for jobs. They're going to be socially meaningful. They're not going to destroy the environment. Wow, who wouldn't go for that? But that's got to be presented in a coherent package, and we're not getting that right now in our political discourse.
Can I just say, is it we need a union push? Is it a union push, or is it an ownership push? Should we have Canadians investing in our industries more than having to use unions to fight them? As much as it's part of the solution, I think there's more of an effort to get people into ownership.
Well, I think we need public ownership of the big economic institutions, the banks, the railways. Fossil fuels is going to fade out, so I'm not so worried about that. But, you know, building housing, I think, you know, it has to be public institutions that drive this. Yes, you can have, you know, private investors who are enlightened and progressive. They exist, they're doing things, but I don't look to that as the alternative, because we're still then operating in a system where investment and profit making is the driving force of the economy, and that's fundamentally what's wrong here. We need an economy that's motivated by social interest. And incidentally, the reason why most countries calling themselves socialists tried to strive for that is they did not create really functioning democracies in doing so. You can't build socialism without really strong and vibrant democracy, because what's socialism? It's everybody's point of view meaning something and having some real input. It's not because you have some enlightened guys saying they're socialists, therefore they know what's done. No, it's a communal society where everyone has a voice and a say, and that's what failed in the 20th century. But even despite that, had some success in Cuba that gives us some encouragement.
I apologize. We ran a couple minutes over, so I'm going to have to stop the discussion here. But if you don't mind, would you stick around and take all the questions more informally afterwards? Thank you. Thanks very much for all your insight, Roger.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for